You're listening to the free ad-sponsored re-release of American Election's Wicked Game, a weekly march through every presidential election from 1789 to 2024. To listen to all episodes right now, ad-free, go to intohistory.com. Subscribers there enjoy ad-free listening, early access, bonus content, and more from a growing collection of great history podcasts. Start your free trial today at intohistory.com. It's November 12, 1909, at Holloway Women's Prison in London, England. A young American woman sits alone on the cold, damp floor of her prison cell. She's wrapped in a thin white sheet to stave off the cold. Days ago, this woman and her suffragette comrades snuck into a banquet filled with political power players like Parliament member Winston Churchill to protest for women's voting rights in Great Britain. Both women were promptly arrested, tried, and sentenced to 30 days in prison. And ever since she arrived at Holloway 4 days ago, American suffragist Alice Paul has been a thorn in the side of the prison staff. Alice looks up. A large female warden and a prison doctor approach her cell.
Is this the one? Yes, doctor.
The doctor sizes up Paul for a moment.
What did you do, Miss Paul? Why are you here?
But Paul doesn't respond. She stares at the wall of her cell defiantly. The warden answers for her.
She made a scene at the Lord Mayor's banquet, threw rocks, broke windows, harassed MPs.
The doctor is curious.
What did you hope to accomplish?
Paul could defend herself. She could point out that newspaper accounts of her protests, like the warden's version of the story, are overblown. She could explain that she didn't break any windows. Her British comrade, suffragette Amelia Brown, broke the window. But even that was an accident. All she did was throw a shoe. But Paul doesn't defend herself. She holds her tongue.
Young lady, I asked you a question.
The warden cracks her baton against the cell door.
Answer him. Well, there's no need for that, warden. She looks peaceful enough now. Why did you call me here? She won't eat. Oh, I see.
The doctor's heard of imprisoned suffragettes refusing to eat, demanding they should be treated as political prisoners. But the doctor won't tolerate that sort of insubordination. Not at Holloway Prison.
Warden, bring her to the empty cell down the hall. Yes, sir. All right, get up. Get up now.
But again, Paul won't cooperate. The warden roughly grabs Paul and forces her into the empty cell down the hall where the doctor is waiting.
Tie her down.
The warden ties Paul to a chair with sheets, one wrapped around her stomach, the other around her chest. Paul can barely breathe as she tries with all her might to resist. The warden straddles Paul's knees and holds her shoulders down. With Paul restrained, 3 other guards come in to assist the doctor.
All right, hold her head back.
Paul tries to turn her head away from the doctor, but his assistants hold her with a vice-like grip. The doctor forces a feeding tube up her nostril and down her throat. Paul violently gags.
This is no good. I'll have to try the other nostril.
As the doctor finally forces the feeding tube down Paul's throat, tears fill her eyes. On his 4th attempt, he finally succeeds. Physically exhausted, emotionally spent, Paul silently weeps as the doctor pours a milk and egg mixture down her throat. For Alice Paul, her hunger strike is over, but her fight for women's rights is just beginning. 27 days later, Alice Paul was released. During her time in the Holloway prison, she endured 59 forced feedings. But the brutal treatment did not deter Paul from her cause. She would soon return to the United States, and she would bring with her the knowledge and tactics she had learned from the British suffragettes. She would stage the first women's suffrage march in Washington, D.C. on March 3, 1913, the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. Before Wilson ever began his term, he would learn that the women's suffrage movement would not be ignored. Wicked Game is sponsored by NetSuite. There's that saying, that's just the cost of doing business, and it makes it sound like there's nothing you can do about certain expenses. And yeah, sure, if you run a business, there are certain things that are just going to cost what they cost, and recently they've probably begun costing more. But not everything is just the cost of doing business. Smart companies know their numbers and can reduce their costs. One great way of doing both is switching to NetSuite, the #1 cloud financial system, bringing accounting, financial management, inventory, and HR into one platform and one source of truth. And with NetSuite, you'll reduce IT costs because NetSuite lives in the cloud with no hardware required, accessible from anywhere. You'll cut the cost of maintaining multiple systems because you've got one unified business management suite, and you improve efficiency by bringing all your major business processes into one platform, slashing manual tasks and errors. Over 37,000 companies have already made the move, so do the math and see how you'll profit with NetSuite this year. By popular demand, NetSuite has extended its one-of-a-kind flexible financing program for a few more weeks. Head to netsuite.com/elections. That's netsuite.com/elections, netsuite.com/elections. Wicked Game is sponsored by BetterHelp. I need to get something off my chest. Think about that phrase. Visualize it. The metaphor is that something is literally on your chest, weighing you down, pressing down upon you, that when you lay in bed at night, there's a heavy burden bearing down on you. And everyone has these weights, deep concerns, feelings of guilt, anger, or misery we try to keep to ourselves. But therapy is a safe space to get things off your chest and to figure out how to work through whatever's weighing you down. And as the world's largest therapy service, BetterHelp has matched 3 million people with professionally licensed and vetted therapists available 100% online. Plus, it's affordable. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to match with a therapist. And if things aren't clicking, you can easily switch to a new therapist anytime. No waiting rooms, no traffic. It couldn't be simpler. So get it off your chest with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/elections today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/elections. From Airship, I'm Lindsey Graham, and this is American Elections Wicked Game. During Wilson's time in office, he faced diverse issues. Wilson implemented his new freedom agenda with antitrust laws, tariff reductions, and progressive social reforms. But a sagging U.S. economy and encroaching international issues clouded Wilson's success. As Europe moved closer to war and Mexico devolved into a bloody revolution, the American president struggled to keep the U.S. on neutral ground. Republicans criticized most of the decisions Wilson made. The GOP saw Wilson's 1912 win as a blip, an accident. The Progressive Party, also known as the Bull Moose Party, had left the Republicans in 1912, splitting the Republican vote. GOP leaders believed that this split was the reason for Wilson's victory. They also believed they could easily retake the White House in 1916 if they just reunited with the Bull Moose Party. But it would not be that simple. Wilson made strong political allies during his time as president. His neutral stance on European woes made him popular with the American people, who largely wanted to stay out of the war. To remove Wilson, Republicans would have to fight his popularity and his non-interventionist posture. In 1916, the GOP would nominate a moderate candidate to lead the charge, Charles Evans Hughes. The Republicans would try to oust Wilson through a strong campaign focused on discrediting his new freedom agenda. But Wilson, a career academic, would prove to be an adept politician, a clever campaigner, and a fighter in his own right. This is episode 33, 1916, Hughes versus Wilson. He kept us out of war. From day one, Wilson got to work on his agenda, lowering tariffs, regulating the banking system, and implementing antitrust reforms. Through these measures, the president hoped to create a new freedom for workers and business owners. Wilson made history by becoming the first president to go to Congress in person and directly appeal to the legislative body on behalf of his agenda. Many Republicans were outraged by this, accusing Wilson of overstepping his bounds. But Wilson didn't back away. He doubled down on his commitment to progressive ideals and vowed to fulfill his promise to the people, saying, "I do not know how to wield a big stick, but I do know how to put my mind at the service of others for the accomplishment of a common purpose." In his first year as president, Wilson pushed through a lower tariff package. He then turned to banking reform. While most politicians agreed that banking reform was necessary, few agreed on how to go about it. With significant input from Wilson, Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. This bill created the Federal Reserve, an agency with a chairman and board of governors selected directly by the president. It also divided the country into 12 regions, each with its own regional bank and its own board, also appointed by the president. Though the Federal Reserve would undergo major adjustments in later administrations, Wilson recognized this legislation as a triumph. He had shown his political acumen during the creation of the bill, relying on political allies, avoiding party and class politics, demonstrating flexibility, and waiting calmly for Congress to deliver. When the president signed the Federal Reserve Act on December 23, 1913, he stated, "All great measures under our system are of necessity party measures, but this cannot be called a partisan measure. This act will be of lasting benefit to the business of the country." But despite Wilson's new freedom reforms, the economy was still in bad shape. As he struggled to tackle antitrust legislation, Wilson almost admitted defeat. He told an advisor, "The only danger that threatens my administration is from depressed business conditions." Republicans saw it differently, though. GOP leaders believed that Wilson would soon trip over his own feet, leaving Republicans an opening to strike. One Republican thought that their party would be restored through the blunders of the Democrats in power and through the natural gravitation of the progressives back to their old allegiance. But Wilson proved to be a stronger opponent than any Republican anticipated. The speed and vigor of Wilson's first year caused one GOP senator to remark, "There is no doubt that Mr. Wilson is showing himself a very adroit politician." But while Wilson would not be slowed by the Republican opposition, he would have to deal with a myriad of issues clamoring for his time and attention. These issues would range from the political to the personal, and soon enough, the weight of the office would take its toll. It's November 12, 1914. Wilson sits in his office, his thoughts consumed by his late wife, Ellen. She passed away just 2 months ago, and Wilson has barely given himself time to mourn. He keeps a full schedule, determined not to let his personal heartache interfere with his public duties. But today, Wilson's resolve will be tested. Come in. Gentlemen, please, sit down. Thank you for seeing us, Mr. President. Thank you for coming, Mr. Trotter. That's newspaper editor William Monroe Trotter. He and the rest of the all-African-American delegation take their seats. Trotter leads off the meeting. I assume you know why we're here, Mr. President. Yes, I have some inkling. Trotter and the activists want to discuss the segregation policies recently put in place at government offices. Mr. President, only 2 years ago, you were heralded as perhaps the second Lincoln. And now the Afro-American leaders who supported you are hounded as traitors to their race. What a change segregation has wrought. Surprised by his directness, Wilson fumbles for the right words. Well, gentlemen, as I've said many times, it takes the world generations to outlive all its prejudices. With respect, that is no reason to continue to give in to those prejudices through your segregationist policies. We know you've allowed experienced black men to be fired just so they wouldn't become the bosses of white men. Wilson's back is up. He is not used to hearing such forthright criticism in his own office, much less from a person of color. He holds his ground. This policy of separation is as far as possible from being a movement against Negroes. It's intended to prevent racial friction. I sincerely have the good of the Negro in mind. This is not what Trotter and his associates want to hear. Trotter's eyes narrow in frustration. He holds his ground as well. We do not need your patronizing, Mr. President. We are not here as wards. We are not here as dependents. We are here as full-fledged American citizens. The government segregation springs from prejudice, and from prejudice alone. In 1912, you received much support from Afro-American voters. If you persist in this policy, we may rescind our loyalty. Let me say this, if you will, that if this organization wishes to approach me again, you must choose another spokesman, Mr. Trotter. You are an American citizen, as fully an American citizen as am I, but you are the only American citizen that has ever come into this office who has talked to me with a tone of passion. That may be true, Mr. President, but I am from a part of the people. My passion is not unique among American citizens. That may be true as well, but you have spoiled the whole cause for which you came. Leave. Leave my office at once. After his meeting with Trotter, Wilson told a cabinet member, I was damn fool enough to lose my temper. But the president did not regret his policies. He continued to endorse segregation in government offices. 6 months later, Wilson allowed the KKK propaganda film Birth of a Nation to be screened at the White House. Wilson would never see the damaging effect of his racist policies, and black disenfranchisement would not become an issue in his re-election bid. Instead, the president focused on promoting his vision of progressivism: fairness for laborers and business owners who were white. In 1914, Wilson signed the Clayton Antitrust Act and Federal Trade Commission Act. Both were designed to curb monopolistic business practices and promote free trade. Wilson argued, "It is our purpose to destroy monopoly and maintain competition as the only effectual instrument of business liberty." So in just 2 years, the president had been able to enact 3 main parts of his new freedom agenda: tariff reduction, banking reform, and antitrust regulations. He saw these reforms as a way to protect free trade and labor rights, and while not perfect, Wilson's efforts earned praise from the head of the American Federation of Labor, Samuel Gompers. "The labor provisions are indeed a magnificent piece of legislation," he said, "according to the working people of our country, the rational, constitutional, and inherent rights of which they have too long been denied." But Republicans claimed that Wilson was playing favorites, benefiting special interest groups at the expense of others. Former President Taft denounced Wilson's actions as partisan politics. Wilson is not governed nearly so much by principle as he would have people believe. Taft went on to call the Clayton Act that outrageous discrimination in favor of trade unions and farmers in the matter of enforcement of the antitrust laws. But Wilson had no problem with his party strengthening ties to labor unions. The president became more progressive on other issues as well. While he and his party remained entrenched in racist views and policies, Wilson began to warm to the idea of women's suffrage. 2 strong groups advocating for women's suffrage gained national attention. The National American Woman Suffrage Association ran a grassroots campaign, gaining suffrage 1 state at a time. Led by suffragist Alice Paul, the National Women's Party took a more extreme view. Paul and her followers wanted a constitutional amendment guaranteeing women the right to vote. Both groups campaigned to get Wilson to endorse women's suffrage, though neither fully trusted the president. 2 weeks after the March 1913 suffrage parade, Alice Paul and 5 other suffragists had met with the president. In the conference, they had referred to Wilson's 1912 campaign for the New Freedom, arguing that a perfect new freedom cannot come until women as well as men are given the right to vote. Wilson disagreed. He had told the women he planned to focus his attention elsewhere. Still, the determined suffragists had continued their campaign, just as Wilson continued to believe that women's suffrage was a matter for settlement by the states and not by the federal government. So the suffragists took their frustration public. Lucy Burns, a leader of the National Woman's Party, stated, "For a disfranchised class seeking political freedom to be informed that they may not question the views of the ruler of their country on the matter of their own political status is really difficult to comprehend." But there were some women who could vote, and Alice Paul made suffrage an election issue when she warned the president that he put his party on record as refusing to help the suffrage cause. The several million enfranchised women cannot fail to remember this fact in deciding upon their party affiliations. Paul's threat seemed to work, in part. After her remarks, Wilson publicly promised to vote for suffrage in his home state of New Jersey whenever it appeared on the ballot. The 1914 midterm elections were a referendum on Wilson's new freedom agenda. Even though Wilson had fulfilled many of his campaign promises, Republicans still won back several congressional seats because Americans weren't voting on labor reforms in the midterms, they were voting on the slow economy. Former President Teddy Roosevelt summed up the election by stating, "The fundamental trouble was that the country was sick and tired of reform. Voters had felt the pinch of poverty, and compared with this, they did not care a rap for social or industrial justice." Still, in spite of Republican gains, Wilson saw reasons for hope. Democrats won seats in several western states, long considered Republican strongholds. After the midterms, Wilson declared, "The Democratic Party, and only the Democratic Party, has carried out policies which the progressive people of this country have desired. There is a real fight on. It is no time for mere manners. I cannot fight rottenness with rosewater." Ultimately, though, the 1916 presidential election would not strictly be a domestic contest between Democratic progressivism and Republican conservatism. The election would also hang on international events, because in the summer of 1914, a 19-year-old Bosnian Serb would single-handedly upend the world order, ignite a global conflict, and make the 1916 presidential election a whole new ballgame. Did you know you can skip ads and promos like these and listen to all episodes of American Election's Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com? And not only will you be getting the whole series ad-free and bingeable, but you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also all ad-free, like Wild West Extravaganza, a journey back to the fascinating, tumultuous, and often violent world of the American Old West. From famous outlaws like Billy the Kid and Jesse James, to lawmen like Wyatt Earp and Wild Bill Hickok, to trailblazing pioneers and frontiersmen, Wild West Extravaganza tells the true stories of the real-life characters who shaped this iconic era. So saddle up and discover the true history of the American frontier, the good, the bad, and the ugly, ad-free at intohistory.com. Did you know you can skip ads and promos like these and listen to all episodes of American Election's Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com? And not only will you be getting the whole series ad-free and bingeable, but you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also ad-free, like Her Half of History. Because even though Hillary Clinton may not have made history when she ran for president in 2016, there have always been women who seized power, spied for their country, created artistic masterpieces, even escaped slavery. Her Half of History is perfect for all those who sat in history class and wondered, what were the women doing all this time? Because the answer is a lot. Get Her Half of History, Wicked Game, and many others ad-free at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. On June 28, 1914, Serbian nationalist Gavrilo Princip assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The murder of the Archduke and his wife Sophie, Duchess of Honenberg, triggered a series of events that spiraled downward into war. Complicated allegiances, militarism, and nationalism drew nearly every European nation into the conflict, and by August of 1914, World War I had begun. In the United States, President Wilson advocated a position of neutrality. Though Americans traded more with Britain and her allies, Wilson sought to keep relations with every European country open. He and his Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, tried to keep the U.S. out of the growing, deadly conflict. But as the war dragged on, it soon took precedence in Americans' consciousness. Most people in the U.S. liked Wilson's neutrality policy. It kept their sons home and their businesses open. But though they didn't want to send soldiers to fight in the trenches, Americans had no problem selling supplies to Europeans. This boosted the sluggish economy as war-torn nations across the Atlantic purchased munitions, clothes, and food. Prominent Republican Elihu Root watched Wilson's popularity climb in frustration. The war is undoubtedly helping the Democrats because it distracts people's attention. Republicans could no longer attack Wilson on economic grounds. The Great War would force them to change their game plan. Simultaneous to the European conflict, Mexico experienced a bloody revolution. In February 1913, a coup known as the 10 Tragic Days had resulted in General Victoriano Huerta overthrowing President Francisco Madero. The U.S. ambassador had urged the American government to recognize Huerta's legitimacy. Wilson had taken a wait-and-see stance in an effort to stay out of the complicated situation and protect American business interests in Mexico. He had promised to support the new Mexican government only when supported in turn by the orderly process of just government based upon law. Wilson had wanted to maintain a policy of watchful waiting to see how the Mexican Revolution would play out. But something that would come to be known as the Tampico Affair would muddy the waters. In April 1914, Mexican troops at the port of Tampico arrested 9 unarmed American sailors. The Mexican general in charge quickly corrected the mistake, releasing the Americans and apologizing. But American Rear Admiral Henry Mayo had not accepted the apology. Tensions between the two militaries escalated until April 21st, when Americans seized the Mexican custom house at Veracruz. After 2 days of bloody fighting, a full-scale war with Mexico had seemed imminent. Ambassadors from Argentina, Brazil, and Chile acted as mediators and diffused the situation. Ultimately, Americans agreed to pull troops out of Veracruz, and Huerta agreed to resign as president. In early 1915, Wilson felt confident that he had made the right decision to de-escalate the situation in Mexico. He told his Secretary of War, Lindley Garrison, There are, in my judgment, no conceivable circumstances which would make it right for us to direct by force or by threat of force the internal process of what is a profound revolution. But Republicans took this chance to publicly berate the president. They called his decisions weak, interpreting the military pullout as an inability to protect American interests. As Wilson and his administration tried to navigate the conflicts in Europe and Mexico, the president's resolve to remain neutral would be severely tested. It's Friday, May 7, 1915, off the southern coast of Ireland. The RMS Lusitania, a British steamship, sails east on its way to Liverpool, England. There are 1,198 crew and passengers aboard, but the Lusitania is in a war zone. German U-boats patrol the waters around the British Isles, looking for ships bringing supplies to their enemies. These submarines have orders to consider any British ship fair game. Lusitania Captain William Turner has ordered his crew to keep a watchful eye for German subs. And at 2:10 p.m., one of the crewmen calls out, "Torpedo!" Captain Turner barely has time to react. As the crewmen recoil from the explosion, Turner's second officer, Perry Hefford, calls out,
"It's a direct hit, sir!"
Captain Turner's worst fears have come true, but there's no time to waste. He leaps into action.
"Send an SOS. Have it read, 'Come at once. Big list off South Head. Position Old Kinsale.' Right away, Captain."
But while Hefford relays the SOS, there's a second explosion. Unbeknownst to its passengers, the Lusitania has war materiel in her hold. The British military legally purchased these munitions from a private American dealer to aid its war effort. Germany knows Britain has been making these purchases, so German ships patrol these waters to prevent the arms shipments from reaching British soldiers. Captain Turner knows this too. He also knows it's highly likely that the munitions aboard the Lusitania have just gone up in flames.
"The Irish coast is close. Hard to starboard. Let's beach her." "Yes, sir."
But the Lusitania is too weakened by the blast, and its hydraulic steering gear is shot. Instead of heading for the safety of the Irish coast, the ship sails in a wide arc. From the bridge, Captain Turner overlooks passengers, flooding the decks to see what has happened.
"Shut off the engines. Let's give the lifeboats a chance to launch safely." "That's not possible, sir. The explosion has damaged the connections. Those boats will have to launch while the ship's still moving."
Without a public announcement system, Captain Turner can't communicate orders to his crew or the passengers. Chaos ensues. On the deck, passengers pitch in to help the rescue operations, but most of the crewmen have abandoned their posts. It's every man for himself. Captain Turner remains on the bridge, where he will stay until the Lusitania is swallowed up by the depths of the Celtic Sea. The Lusitania sank 18 minutes after the torpedo struck its hull. Captain Turner went down with his ship, but was swept away by ocean currents. He and approximately 700 other passengers survived. The rest died. Among them were 128 Americans. The deaths of their countrymen turned American opinion against Germany, and it left President Wilson with a crucial decision. After the attack on the Lusitania, Wilson told his Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, "I wish with all my heart I saw a way to carry out the double wish of our people, to maintain a firm front in what we demand of Germany, and yet do nothing that might involve us in the war." Wilson remained determined to stay out of the conflict. He spent several days drafting a diplomatic note to Germany. The May 13, 1915 message, signed by Wilson and Bryan, demanded that Germany cease firing on passenger ships. But Wilson took a risky step in how he ended the note, writing, "The Imperial German government will not expect the government of the United States to omit any act necessary to maintaining the rights of the United States and its citizens and of safeguarding their free exercise and enjoyment." Bryan worried that Germany would interpret this phrase as a threat. To Bryan's relief, the German ambassador did not seem affronted and continued unofficial talks with Wilson. The president urged Germany to end its submarine warfare, and in return, he promised to get the British to stop blockading German ports. But Secretary of State Bryan wanted to take a softer approach. He knew the Lusitania had been carrying munitions. Bryan hoped to find a peaceful resolution in which both sides admitted fault and entered into a cooling-off treaty. He stated, "It is not likely that either side will win so complete a victory as to be able to dictate terms, and if either side does win such a victory, it will probably mean preparation for another war. It would seem better to look for a more rational basis for peace." But Wilson did not agree with Bryan's almost clairvoyant stance. He wrote a second diplomatic note to Germany with an even more threatening tone, so threatening that Bryan refused to sign it. On June 9, 1915, William Jennings Bryan resigned as Secretary of State. He gave a public statement asserting, "I believe I can do more on the outside to prevent war than I can do on the inside. I can work to direct public opinion so it will not exert pressure for extreme action." Bryan's departure had the president worried. It could signal to Germany American disunity, and closer to home, it might look like a rift had occurred in Democratic Party leadership at a time when party unity was of the utmost importance. In 1916, the Republicans were more than eager to reclaim the White House from the Democrats, and to defeat Wilson in the election, they would need to find a candidate who could unite the Republican Party. They found a silver-bearded judge named Charles Evans Hughes. Judge Hughes had been a loyal Republican for decades and served 2 terms as New York governor. Since 1910, Hughes had been a Supreme Court justice and was therefore unsullied from the political disasters of the 1912 election. Throughout the early part of the year, Hughes stayed silent on whether or not he would seek the Republican nomination, but in April 1916, a newspaper article asserted that Hughes made a strong candidate because of the atmosphere of uncertainty or mystery with which he had surrounded himself. The mystery didn't last long. On June 10, 1916, on only the 3rd round of balloting, Hughes received the Republican nomination. He immediately resigned his seat on the bench of the Supreme Court and accepted his party's call, the only Supreme Court justice to ever do so. He stated, "I have not desired the nomination, but I cannot fail to answer with the pledge of all that is in me to the service of our country." Many Republicans hoped Hughes would reunite their broken party. One party leader told a friend, "The nomination of Hughes has been received with the utmost enthusiasm by the independent voters and by a large fraction of the progressives." But the Republican platform did not excite reform-minded voters. Hughes promoted a conservative platform of a protective tariff, an efficient transportation system, and standing firmly with Mexico. He also advocated preparing to enter the Great War with Germany, though he didn't commit to full U.S. involvement. But Hughes did take a clear position on women's suffrage. He supported a constitutional amendment, stating, "There is an incurable defect of character in the administration with respect to the weakness and vacillation which have characterized it, and we cannot expect improvement from that source." Hughes' liberal stance on suffrage could be seen as both a foil to Wilson and an olive branch to progressive Republicans. The Bull Moose Party was created by Teddy Roosevelt out of thin air in 1912, but it struggled to maintain a national presence, though many core members remained loyal. In 1916, the Progressive Party held its national convention the same week as the Republicans. Again, they nominated their founder, Teddy Roosevelt, but this time Roosevelt declined the nomination and endorsed Judge Hughes. With this, the Progressive Party as a national force was dead. One Republican predicted 3/4 of their number, including all the rational and sane, will support Mr. Hughes. Democrats intended to test that theory. President Wilson went into the National Democratic Convention in a strong position. He had achieved many political wins. He had become more liberal in his views, and he had nominated a progressive judge to the Supreme Court. Further, he had maintained American neutrality in the war. A friend told the president, "The Republican Party was for half a century a constructive party, and the Democratic Party was the party of negation and complaint. We have taken the play from them. The Democratic Party has become the party of construction." But Wilson's recent change on military policy was a potential stumbling block. In the past few months, Wilson had begun to advocate for preparedness. He had suggested personnel and budget increases for the Army and Navy. Peace-minded Democrats worried what this might mean for the future. But at the convention in June, their concerns took a backseat to Wilson's popularity. On June 17th, Wilson received his party's nomination by acclamation rather than ballot. William Jennings Bryan attended the convention and gave a speech saying, "I join the American people in thanking God that we have a president who does not want this nation plunged into this war." Bryan's speech showed Democrats that there were no hard feelings between the president and his former Secretary of State. The convention closed with its chair saying, "In particular, we commend to the American people the splendid diplomatic victories of our great president, who has preserved the vital interests of our government and its citizens and kept us out of war." On the campaign trail in 1916, international conflict would trump domestic concerns. Democrats would champion Wilson as the anti-war candidate, a restrained but prepared president. Republicans would attack Wilson's posture on the war. In the end, though, Wilson would not have to win the war of ideas against Charles Evans Hughes. On the campaign trail, Judge Hughes would prove to be his own worst enemy. Tired of ads and promos like these? Want to skip ahead to newer elections? You can listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. But not only that, you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also all ad-free. That includes the American Revolution podcast, a deep and thorough investigation of the times, people, and politics behind America's fight for independence. Also, The Battles, because we can't start a new American nation without guns. And the American Revolution podcast tells the story of the revolution from beginning to end, from its origins in the French and Indian War, through the war itself, and on to the founding of the United States. Get American Elections Wicked Game, the American Revolutions podcast, and many others ad-free with bonus content at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com.
How do you solve a crime in reverse when you believe that someone was murdered but have no clue who the victim was?
We have to do our job, and we have to find out who did they kill, if it's possible. How are we going to do that?
I'm Jake Halpern, and this is Deep Cover: The Nameless Man. Listen on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
It's 11 a.m. on August 19th, 1916, outside the Commercial Club, a well-known restaurant in San Francisco. Charles Hughes, campaign manager, is having a bad day. Judge Hughes has been campaigning in the West for the past few weeks. Though he's a seasoned politician, his speeches have largely fallen flat. But today, he hopes to make a big impression at a fancy luncheon with prominent Bay Area businessmen. Unfortunately, Hughes is unaware of a growing problem in his California campaign. His staffers have been playing favorites with conservative Republicans in the Golden State, and many progressives feel snubbed. Hughes' campaign manager is doing his best to prevent a rift in the party. He stands outside the Commercial Club, arguing with the club's owner. Sir, you're putting me in an impossible position. I work for Mr. Hughes. You've heard of him, haven't you? I need that sign taken down. Not a chance. I don't care who you work for. The Commercial Club is an open shop. I support free opportunity of labor, and I don't care who knows it. Mr. Hughes is due to arrive any minute. I've already worked out a deal with the Culinary Union. They've agreed to serve Mr. Hughes and his guests only if that sign gets taken down. Not on your life. We have the labor bastards in this town where we want them, and we're not going to let up. But what if you just hid the sign during the luncheon today? No, I refuse to be bullied by some union-loving progressive. I assure you, sir, I am no progressive, nor have I ever been. I'm a Republican, just like you, trying to put on a lunch for other Republicans. Just then, Hughes strolls into the middle of the confrontation. What's the matter here? Sir, we have a minor problem. There's been a strike of the culinary workers in this city. I worked out a deal with the waiters union, and they've agreed to serve for your luncheon today. But this man, the Commercial Club owner, refuses to take down this placard. Hughes looks up at the sign, which contains only 2 words, open shop. Hughes turns to the club owner. What does open shop mean? It means I won't be dictated to by a union. That's what it means. Like I said, I support free opportunity of labor, and any union man who doesn't like it can find work somewhere else. And that's fine by us, but the luncheon starts in an hour, 60 minutes. Who will serve Mr. Hughes and his guests? I have a staff, all eager young men willing to work hard. Your luncheon will be fine. Well, it sounds like this man's already solved our problem. Hughes' campaign manager pulls the judge aside. Mr. Hughes, it could hurt your prospects if you are seen being served by non-union workers. I'm a national candidate. This is a local strike. When it comes to local differences, I have no concern. The luncheon went smoothly. Hughes impressed the businessmen, but not Republican progressives. In his speech, the judge did not mention the labor strike, nor his position on unions. Pro-union voters were livid. One newspaper reported that Hughes was wined and dined by the would-be union crushers. Another printed the headline, "Union men refuse to serve at club. Cafes send open shop men to wait on Hughes." President Wilson recognized Hughes' gaffe immediately, but he didn't go on the attack. Wilson told his staffer, "I am following the rule never to murder a man who is committing suicide." In the 1916 campaign, Wilson wanted to win an outright victory, not a plurality as he had in 1912. And so the president ignored the long-standing tradition that sitting presidents did not campaign for themselves. In the late summer, Wilson made multiple public appearances and speeches. But instead of attacking Hughes, he reiterated his new freedom message of business regulations and social reform from his previous campaign. Highlighting his successes of the past 4 years, Wilson said, "People's energies and initiative should be set free, as we have set them free." Hughes, on the other hand, did not hesitate to attack Wilson. The Republican candidate argued that Wilson had become the pawn of special interest groups. The new freedom, Hughes contended, put the needs of the few above the needs of the many. Wilson fired back, asserting, "I am a progressive. I do not spell it with a capital P, but I think my pace is just as fast as those who do." And during the campaign, Wilson put his money where his mouth was. In August 1916, interstate railroad workers threatened to strike unless their employers instituted an 8-hour workday. Rail company owners refused. Wilson's labor secretary tried to mediate a solution between the two groups, but neither side would give. In late August, talks broke down, and rail workers set September 4th as their strike date. Wilson intervened. After speaking with both sides separately, the president realized he had only one option. On August 29th, Wilson went to Capitol Hill. He asked Congress to legislate an 8-hour workday for all rail workers as a way to avoid a disastrous strike. Representative William Adamson introduced the measure, and it quickly passed both houses along party lines. Wilson signed the Adamson Act on September 3rd, one day before the scheduled strike. Judge Hughes condemned Wilson's actions and the Adamson Act. He argued that the president had buckled under the pressure of labor's demands. Hughes claimed that he would look out for labor rights, but he would never surrender to any force of any kind. This speech, combined with his actions in San Francisco, told pro-labor supporters where Hughes stood. But this hotly contested domestic issue would soon be eclipsed by international events. In May 1915, days after the Lusitania sank, Wilson had given a speech arguing for America's continued neutrality. He had made an off-the-cuff remark stating, "The example of America must be the example, not merely of peace because it will not fight, but of peace because peace is the healing and elevating influence of the world, and strife is not. There is such a thing as a man being too proud to fight. There is such a thing as a nation being so right that it does not need to convince others by force that it is right." To many, Wilson's words made sense, but Republicans heard the phrase, "too proud to fight," and began mocking it during the campaign, with Hughes asserting that he was not at all too proud to fight. When he became president, the Republican declared, the U.S. would not ignore the war, but prepare for it if it came. Hughes also argued that if he had been president in 1915, he would have handled Germany with a show of force. The Lusitania would not have sunk on his watch. But Hughes' claims made many voters nervous. His stance sounded like a call to arms, and many Republicans valued peace. Wilson's position offered Americans more comfort. The president argued that America should be prepared for war, but he defended U.S. neutrality, pointing out, "There's only one choice against peace, and that is war." Wilson's campaign slogan said it all: "He kept us out of war." Still, Hughes refused to back down. Republican leaders saw Wilson as little more than an accidental president, anointed by the rift in their own party. So they stepped up their attacks on his administration. Teddy Roosevelt officially rejoined the Republican Party and began campaigning for Hughes, laying the blame for American deaths on the Lusitania at Wilson's feet, feeling that his presidency had been darkened by the shadows of men, women, and children who have risen from the ooze of the ocean bottom and from graves in foreign lands, the shadows of the tortured dead. In October, as the election closed in, the barbs would aim even lower. Republicans issued statements accusing Wilson of neglecting his dead wife's grave. They claimed he never visited her gravesite in Rome, Georgia, leaving the long grasses to obscure the mildewing headstone. This was wholly untrue, and so Wilson shot back, telling a reporter, "I have such contempt for Mr. Hughes now that I don't want to pay him the compliment of referring to him. He has sunk so low." On Election Day, November 7th, 1916, voters had to wade through these attacks to get to the relevant issues. Republican candidate Hughes championed a women's suffrage amendment, but had turned a blind eye to labor reform. Democratic President Wilson took the opposite position on these concerns. And though he had made strides on social reforms and even the economy, in the end, the election would hang on a single issue: his promise to keep America out of the Great War. As results came in that evening, Hughes won several states in the East, including New York, leading a few newspapers to call the election for Hughes and head to bed. They woke up on November 8th to a different story. Most Western states had voted for Wilson. The president took California, where Hughes had defended unionized labor, and Wilson won in 10 of the 12 states where women had the vote. Voters had discarded issues of reform and economy and suffrage. They had voted on war or peace. Wilson won by razor-thin margins in many states. He took New Hampshire by only 56 votes. But after days of careful vote counting, Wilson ended up with 277 electoral votes to Hughes' 254. Given the closeness of the race, Hughes did not concede defeat until November 22nd. Wilson had campaigned on a non-interventionist platform. He had promised to keep America out of the Great War which was ravaging Europe. But the escalating conflict overseas would make that impossible. In response to growing German aggression, the U.S. would be drawn into the war. Thousands of Americans would be killed or injured on European battlefields, and the Democratic Party would abandon Woodrow Wilson. In the aftermath of the Bloody War and in the wake of a deadly global pandemic, a Republican senator from Ohio would rise to prominence and offer the American people something they truly craved: a return to normal. This is episode 33 of American Elections' Wicked Game, 1916, He Kept Us Out of War. On the next episode, the election of 1920. In the wake of World War I and the deadly Spanish flu pandemic, Democrat James M. Cox and Republican Warren G. Harding both vie to lead America out of the darkness of the past and into the light of the modern era. Icebergs, jagged rocks and rocky straits, mutinies, misfortune, and broadside battles. There are more tales of the sea than survivors to tell them, but the podcast Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is doing a good job, and you can listen to all episodes of that podcast plus many others, including American Elections' Wicked Game, without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is one of my favorites from last year, a podcast about the greatest mishaps, misfortune, and misadventures of the sea. You'll hear stories of corruption, greed, bad intentions, and just plain horrible decision-making that resulted in some of the worst maritime disasters from all over the world. And some of these are more recent than you think. All episodes are ad-free, including bonus content and more at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. This episode contains reenactments and dramatized details, and while in most cases we can't know exactly what was said, all our dramatizations are based on historical research. American Elections' Wicked Game is an Airship production, hosted, edited, and executive produced by me, Lindsey Graham. Sound design by Derek Behrens. Music by Lindsey Graham. Co-executive produced by Stephen Walters in association with Ritual Productions. Written and researched by C.L. Salazar. Fact-checking by Greg Jackson from the podcast History That Doesn't Suck.